Good evening, everyone. My name is Carlos Pio, and I recently joined the Center for Latin American Studies here at ANU. And I'd like to welcome you all for this evening event, and especially Professor Barry Carr, who is visiting us from Melbourne. Professor Carr was for a long time associated with La Trobe University, was the head of the Institute of Latin American Studies there, has an extensive list of publications in Latin America in diverse topics, from the left in Latin America to more historical and contemporary subjects, such as the responses to adjustment policies, to globalization and trade agreements, and now taking a different approach to the issue of Latin America development, looking into the industry of tourism. His talk tonight is "Why Study the History of Tourism and Leisure in Latin America, Comparing the Development of Acapulco and Cancun in Mexico from 1927 to 2012. I would like to invite him to his lecture, 40 minutes, and then we'll have question and answers.
You're going to be a tough chairperson.
Oh,
good. Oh, you have to be with me. Well, thank you very much for the invitation to come on this wintry evening. This is a relatively new topic area for me, the history of tourism and leisure. Most of, as Carlos has pointed out, most of my work in the past has been on labor, agrarian history, the history of the left in Latin America. So you might say, why is somebody with my kind of a background becoming interested in the history of tourism? Well, some of my enemies have cruelly suggested that this is simply an excuse for me to be able to spend, at somebody else's expense, time on the beaches of Latin America. Well, that's absolutely untrue. In fact, you will not find me on a beach, even if you drag me there, while I enjoy looking at beaches and even walking along them. I certainly don't enjoy sitting on them. Actually, there's not such a huge difference between what I've been doing for the last 30, 35 years and this work on the history of tourism and leisure. And I may have time to point out the links between those during the presentation. I've entitled this "Why Study Tourism." I'm not actually going to be spending time abstractly talking about the history of tourism. I'm going to let that kind of emerge from the focus on two areas of Mexico, two, by no means the only places in Mexico which are important tourism resort areas. They're both actually on the coast, but I certainly wouldn't want to imply that tourism can be reduced to looking at coastal or beach resorts. They just happen to be two that I'm looking at in this particular talk. I think that the history of tourism and leisure provides us with a fantastic opportunity to cross disciplinary boundaries and to raise vital questions in political, economic, cultural, social history. It's about a profoundly important economic phenomenon, given the importance of tourism in the balance of payments. It's an invisible export of enormous importance for a number of countries in Latin America. It's an interesting window on the relationship between states and civil societies. It's an opportunity for looking at how countries represent themselves to both domestic and international tourist markets. It's about struggles over space. And in that sense, I suppose you could say that there's an obvious bridge between my interest in tourism and earlier concerns I had with the history of land reform, the history of workers and trade unions and labour history. Especially since I'm going to be talking here about some very valuable land on the coast, which inevitably the value of that land has given rise to important struggles over time, over control and ownership of those spaces. Tourism is also about leisure. You have to have leisure time to be able to do tourism. It forces us to ask questions about when did leisure time emerge in sufficient quantities in Latin America to enable people to devote time to go on tourism, on holidays or vacations. When, and that makes us ask questions about things like the evolution of the workday. We know very little about these things. Research on tourism and the history of tourism has boomed in the last 10, 15 years in the United States and in Western Europe. But in Latin America, there's been relatively little work on the history of tourism. Geographers and anthropologists are the pioneers for the academic study of tourism, but historians have really have neglected the area. Maybe because they regard it as being trivial, not worthy of study, it's all a bit marginal, so the argument is made, somewhat frivolous, not worthy of serious investigation. I think all of those are very, very incorrect judgments. So I'm going to introduce the topic by briefly showing you where Cancun and Acapulco are. Now this, of course, shows you where Cancun is the, Cancun is the red dot there. It's on the eastern coast of what was called the Yucatan Peninsula. In southeastern Mexico, it stretches out into the Gulf of Mexico, or in this case, the Caribbean. And Acapulco is not marked on the map, but it's roughly there. So it's about southwest of Mexico City on the Pacific coast. So we have two iconic resorts, one looking out to the Pacific, Acapulco, and the other looking out to the Caribbean, the east coast of the United States, and to Western Europe. Now I do have images, and I do want to show you some of those images, but I'm not going to blend them with my presentation. I find that really quite difficult. Now, I'm going to be introducing the comparison of Acapulco and Cancun constantly, go backwards and forwards between Acapulco and Cancun as two different models of political, economic, social development in Mexico, and I'm going to compare them on a range of in a range of areas. Acapulco has a long history of non-tourist development. It was a very important port of the Spanish colony of New Spain up until the beginning of the 19th century. Some of you may know of the importance of the Manila trade, of the Manila galleons that linked New Spain or Mexico to both the Philippines and to China and Japan during the colonial period. It's a relatively isolated area. It was not connected to central Mexico by road until 1927. The only communications you could have would be by sea or by rail and sea. Having said that, historians, I think, have tended to exaggerate the isolation of Acapulco. In fact, the maritime links which linked Acapulco to further north along the coast of Pacific Mexico to the United States, to California, and further south to Central America and to the Pacific coast of South America, did make Acapulco quite a cosmopolitan city. Even though it was isolated from the rest of Mexico, its links with the other parts of the Americas were quite significant. The first road from Mexico City, the capital of Mexico, to Acapulco was opened in 1927. Before then, it took travelers from central Mexico 3 to 7 days to make it to Acapulco. In 1927, with the building of a road, it was a rather poor road, but nevertheless it was possible for the first time to travel from central Mexico, where most of the population of Mexico has historically been located, to the Pacific coast town in about 12 to 14 hours if you had a very, very good car and you were prepared to put up with terrible conditions. The very early development of Acapulco as a tourist resort began in the early 1930s. It really only takes off, though, in a big way in the late 1940s, and it's only in the 50s and 1960s and early 1970s that Acapulco adopted its iconic character. Real estate development and tourism were very, very closely involved in the development of Acapulco. And there were both Mexican and US and European pioneers. I've mentioned the names here too. Individuals about whom we know very, very little. I'm trying to track them down. I've been trying to track them down over the last 5 years. Men called Albert Pullen and Wolf Schönborn. Paul Getty is obviously a much better known figure. Getty was one of the US millionaires who developed a very early interest in Acapulco based on a visit he made in the early 1940s. And he then opened up an important hotel in an area of Acapulco known as Puerto Marquez. Carl Redstrom was a big US businessman who made his fortunes in the 1940s and 1950s manufacturing hair rollers, hair curlers. He bought himself a hotel, the Villa Vera Hotel in Acapulco, which attracted a lot of Hollywood luminaries in the 50s and 60s, in the same way as some older hotels, Hotel Flamingo and the Hotel Mirador, had done so from the 1940s. So from the 1940s onwards, Acapulco was linked, at least in terms of the global public imaginary, to the world of elites, of show business, Hollywood, film stars. This was an important part of the image of Acapulco, although, as I'll point out a little bit later, it's somewhat misleading in that it takes our attention away from the fact that Acapulco, even in the days when it was had this iconic flavour, was always a very strongly domestic tourist centre, and a place actually where people of modest incomes could spend their holidays. Now, Cancun, by contrast, was a very different kind of a place. When Cancun began to be developed as a new, integrally constructed tourism resort in the early 1970s, it was constructed out of virtually nothing at all. Now, if you look at the early boosterism literature about Cancun, you'll see that lots and lots of references to Cancun being, and I'm quoting here, a utopian project, a population that emerged out of nothing, a city of nothing but immigrants, no natives here. These are references to the fact that the area of around Cancun was very sparsely populated until the 1970s. The limited number of people who lived in the Cancun area were involved in shifting cultivation, of corn cultivation, milpa farming, but also tapping of chicle. Chicle is the raw material from which chewing gum was made. And in fact, the history of chewing gum is very closely linked to the history of Yucatan and the state where Cancun is, which is called Quintana Roo. Just as the isolation of Acapulco has been much exaggerated, I think it's also true that we've exaggerated the extent to which tourism in Cancun was a recent commodity boom. In fact, tourism in Cancun, while clearly very recent, was one more cyclical commodity boom of the kind that coastal Yucatan and the state of Quintana Roo experienced from the late 19th century. Cancun, unlike Mexico, unlike Acapulco, Cancun was a state-supervised project to build what they call in Mexico an integrated tourism development pole. It's the best known of these poles, but in the early 1970s, the Mexican government investigated tourism opportunities all over Mexico in order to try and establish carefully planned integrated tourism poles. There are some other ones, Los Cabos in the southern tip of Baja California, Ixtapa, Zihuatanejo, which is a new resort area north of Acapulco. There are tourism resorts of this kind, new ones established literally from nothing on the Pacific coast of Oaxaca state. So there's a whole series of these integrated tourism development poles. The intention in the case of Cancun was to exploit its geographical position relative to the east and southeast of the United States and Canada and Europe. If you actually look, if you recall that map of Mexico, you'll see that Cancun looks to Europe, it looks to the Caribbean, it looks upwards to the eastern coast of the United States. Acapulco, as far as its hinterland for international tourism, looked rather to California and to the southern part of the United States and to the central regions of the US. The origins of Cancun, the Cancun project, go back to 1966 and 1967, when the Banco de Mexico, Mexico's national central bank, conducted research in order to find a way in which Mexico could tap into an enormous boom in tourism in the Caribbean that was happening in the 60s and 70s, in the Bahamas, in Puerto Rico, in the Dominican Republic. But also this is a period when Hawaii began to take off as a huge mass tourism market. The Mexican government, I think, was very, very aware of the fact that there was also a gap in the market opened up by the exit of Cuba as a tourism territory for North America, and particularly for US tourists. With the coming of the Cuban Revolution, 1959, with the US blockade of Cuba, which had had an important tourism industry before 1959, was off the map as far as US tourists were concerned. The interest of the Mexican government in establishing these new integrated poles of tourism development was also sparked off by an awareness that by the late 60s and early 1970s, Acapulco's growth was stagnating. Acapulco was becoming what tourism, economics of tourism people call an overly mature tourism resort area. And there were also problems with pollution in Acapulco, which were creating tension amongst both Mexican tourists as well as international tourists. Pollution of beaches that had happened as a result of the massive urbanization of Acapulco. The other reason why Cancun emerged in the late 60s and 1970s was to provide employment opportunities and some growth to a regional economy in southeastern Mexico, which is extremely stagnant by this period. The classic staple crop of Yucatan was henequen, or fiber, sisal, which had entered into a period of acute crisis by the 1940s and 1950s. So unemployment was very, very high in that area of Mexico, and it's not uncommon for development specialists and state economic planners to see tourism as a golden opportunity of generating opportunities for employment. Now, the development of Acapulco touristically was slow and rather uneven. Growth was very modest until the late 1940s and early 1950s. It was during the period of the presidency of Miguel Alemán that who was president in Mexico from 1946 to 1952, that most historians see as the first phase of the boom period of tourism. And I'm going to say something about the peculiarities of the Alemán presidency a little bit later in this talk. The tourism development, both domestic and international, of Acapulco reached its peak roughly in the period from 1956 to the early 1970s. And then, say, post-1975, growth stagnated due to concern with pollution and overdevelopment. Now, Acapulco has always drawn much of its domestic tourists from central Mexico and Mexico City. That's one of the great advantages that Acapulco has always had. It's not very far from the main center of population. Mexico City today has 24 million people. The larger Central Valley of Mexico has about 35 million people. It's been possible at various periods in time to visit Acapulco within 12 hours, then it became 7, and now on a new superhighway linking Acapulco and Mexico City, the Autopista del Sol, you can actually travel to Acapulco in about 4.5 hours. So that was the great advantage of Acapulco, still is today. It's a place you can go to on weekends. You can literally go on a Friday evening by car or by bus, spend 2 or 3 nights, go back to work on Monday morning. You can do that on weekends. You can also during what in Mexico are known as puentes, which are those periods of those blocks of time when there's a holiday on a Friday or a Monday, so you can take an extra day off, and so you have Friday and Saturday and Sunday and Monday. They're bridges. This is an advantage that Acapulco has, but it's also a disadvantage. It introduced an element of extreme seasonality and unevenness in the occupation of hotels. Lots of demand on weekends and during peak and during these puentes, these holiday seasons, but often empty hotels between Monday and Thursday. As tourism begins to falter in Acapulco with the stories of pollution of beaches and so on from the mid-1970s onwards, and with increasing competition from Cancun and other both newly developed resorts such as Puerto Vallarta, Mazatlan, as well as the rivals to Cancun like Los Cabos, foreign tourism to Acapulco began to drastically decline. The latest figures on Acapulco are that about 95% of tourists to Acapulco are Mexican. This is for an iconic resort that until the 1970s we would normally associate outside of Mexico, Acapulco with international jet setters. These figures on tourism present serious methodological challenges to social scientists. Normally tourism figures are based upon occupation of hotels. It's nights spent in hotels, which was probably pretty decent way of measuring popularity until about 30 years ago. But with the development of the so-called second home phenomenon, when people buy a house or buy an apartment or buy a condo, which they may use occasionally and rent out to others, hotel occupations by night is no longer such a reliable source of information. So it may very well be that the figure of only 5% of foreign tourists in Acapulco actually understates the importance of foreigners there, because many foreigners have over the years bought houses or condos or apartments, but when they stay in those and when they rent them out to their friends, or even when they rent them out to people they advertise for on the internet, these overnight stays are not counted in the so-called global satellite figures of the National Bank in Mexico. Hotel owners, not only in Mexico but elsewhere, hate this phenomenon of the second home, of people renting out their home because they don't pay taxes. It's it's regarded as a form of, as they say in Spanish, competencia desleal, disloyal competition. But it is a very, very significant phenomenon. In Acapulco today, but also it's true in a couple of other resorts, there are even there are workers with very modest incomes, maybe only $5 to $8 US a day, but who are the beneficiaries of publicly subsidized housing, who've built or have bought or been given subsidized housing in places like Acapulco, and they themselves often rent out that accommodation on weekends to people. Cancun, in contrast with Acapulco, has had continuous and rapid development, albeit with hurricane-induced interruptions. That's a really significant problem for Cancun. But from 1995 onwards, the original center of Cancun, the hotel zone, is being considered overbuilt, and development is now moving south of Cancun to the area that's been labeled rather brilliantly the Mayan Riviera, and I'll show you where that is in a minute on the map. I think maybe I should every now and again intersperse these comments with some images. Here's a map of the spatial development of Acapulco between 1950 and 1989. This is Acapulco Bay. This area over here was the original core, historical core of Acapulco. This is the first area that was developed for residential development. And then slowly hotels began to be built over this area here and down here, the area known as Puerto Marquez. So if I showed you these figures for over a 40 or 50 year period, you'll see some dramatic examples of the expansion of the city. The old core, the old Zócalo, the main square of Acapulco in 1930, just 3 years after the opening of the road, the highway between Mexico City and Acapulco. This is the beach known as Los Hornos. I'll go back and show you roughly where that is. That's this area over here, one of the earliest beaches. This is what it was looking like in 1934. This is an aerial view of Acapulco from the Las Playas area. This area here, is an area which was the first major real estate development in Acapulco. This area over here is Los Hornos. This is where most of Acapulco's tourism development is today. And that's a view looking backwards to, from Los Hornos Bay. This is one of the early hotels on Los Hornos, known as the Hotel Papagayo. I'm going to be referring to this hotel in a little bit further along. JFK and Jackie's honeymoon in 1953. Acapulco, the history of Acapulco is partly the history. It's only a very small part of the history, but much publicized. It's the history of the rich and the famous making their way to this exotic other, tropical other. I'm going to stop at this point and go back to the text here. Now Acapulco, going back here to looking at, comparing and contrasting again, Acapulco was largely the result of a series of uncoordinated private sector developments from the over a period of 60 years, even though many of these private sector developers of Acapulco were actually influential politicians and their cronies. In fact, tourism in Acapulco was one of the most important areas in which a fragment of what some Mexican historians call the new revolutionary bourgeoisie of Mexico was forged. Mexico had a revolution, one of the first social revolutions in the 20th century, 1910, 1920, and post-1920, a series of governments consolidated the social and economic gains of that revolution, but increasingly moved the center of political and economic action towards the right. The revolution, in a sense, became a conservative phenomenon. And so the term revolutionary bourgeoisie is a reference to the process whereby the military and political leaders of Mexico, especially in the 1930s and 1940s, began to use their access to power to enrich themselves. They did so through the increasingly politicized allocation of bank loans from development bodies like the Banco de Mexico and a bank known as Nacional Financiera, and through the distribution of profitable government contracts for infrastructure development, particularly road building. So, uncoordinated private sector development, but also in the case of Acapulco, Acapulco's development as a tourism mecca was driven in part by expropriation of land reform plots handed to Mexican peasants or campesinos as a result of the land reform conducted by the Mexican Revolution. Land reform was one of the great slogans and programs of the Mexican Revolution, and from the 1920s, but particularly from the 1930s onwards, large amounts of land formerly private land was handed out to peasants to be farmed both individually and collectively. Now, most of the land reform in Mexico didn't happen on the coast, but nevertheless, there were peasants who lived near coasts who did receive land, and land handed out under the land reform was known as ejido land. The term ejido, E-J-I-D-O, was the term used in Mexico to refer to land reform parcels. Now, the expropriation of these peasant land holdings close to the ocean was a crucial mechanism in the development of private tourism and hotel properties, as well as the development of real estate. So really, to study the history of tourism in Acapulco from the 30s onwards, 30s, 40s, especially late 40s, early 50s, is to study the process whereby peasants had their land holdings expropriated to make way for the building of hotels and for the development of real estate subdivisions. The reason is that the core area, the old historic core of Acapulco, known as the Fundo Urbano, or Fundo Legal, was very small, and virtually all the most important land that could be used for tourism development along the coast was actually controlled by peasants who received land on the coast in the form of these land reform parcels, which had not been very, very successful. The land was often not of very, very high quality. So the tourism expansion of Acapulco beyond the small historic core centred on the town hall and the central square could only happen insofar as it required access to peasant-hold land. And it meant, therefore, that ejidos, these peasant land holdings, would have to be expropriated somehow by the central government and then parcelled out or sold to private developers. This happened already in the 1930s, but began to happen on a fairly large scale in the mid and late 1940s, particularly during the presidency. I can't read that. How many? 10 minutes, wow. It happened particularly during the presidency of Miguel Alemán, 1946 to 1952, when there's a very important development shift, economic and political development shift happening in Mexico. I mentioned here at the bottom the names of some of the major figures, many of them politicians, many of them generals, some of them members of the cabinet of President Miguel Alemán, as well as Miguel Alemán himself, who benefited from this process of expropriation of peasant land holdings in order to promote hotel development. Miguel Alemán fell in love as president of Mexico with Acapulco and visited. I counted the number of times he paid visits to Acapulco. Any opportunity he had between late 1946 and 1952, he went to Acapulco. So really, this is one example of why I think it's worthwhile studying tourism, because in this case you've got an example of how tourism involves a study of land use. It's about struggles over increased value of land. The land of the coast of Acapulco wasn't worth very much until Acapulco began to be a tourism mecca. But once it increased in value, then inevitably you were going to get struggles over the use of that land. So it's about struggle really between classes here. Struggles over the ownership of land and the use of land. So the emergence of tourism on a big scale in Acapulco in the late 40s and early 50s necessarily provoked some opposition from poorer inhabitants. And that's one of the things I've been looking at in my own research. With the development of Acapulco as a major tourism area, the demand for labour in hotels increased enormously. So it led to massive in-migration to Acapulco. It had been a very small town until the 1920s, but from the 40s onwards, tens of thousands of poor migrants arrived in Acapulco to work in hotels and restaurants. Today, the population of Acapulco is over 1 million people. It was like 22,000 in the 1920s. Where were such people going to find accommodation? Many of them simply squatted. The term in Mexico to refer to a squatter on land is a paracaidista, literally a parachutist. And this led to all kinds of conflicts in Acapulco, conflicts of an environmental kind, conflicts of a political kind. The tourists in Acapulco could actually see where their workers in their hotels lived, because the workers lived on the hills. Often had wonderful views of the bay, but almost no public utilities, water, drainage, and so on. And there were constant attempts to try and relocate the squatters from the hills to new towns, which the government built, but which the squatters preferred not to move into. Now, the unplanned private sector nature of development in Acapulco was one of the reasons, part of the logic for developing Cancun in a radically different way. The Mexican government was aware of the fact that some of the problems of Acapulco came from the unplanned nature of development. So Cancun from the beginning was an initiative of the federal government, and particularly an organization, a para-state enterprise, of which there have been many in Mexico, called Fonatur, the National Fund for Tourism Development, that set rules and shaped policy for the private sector. It was actually Cancun that pioneered the use of multilateral funding from the Inter-American Development Bank and from the World Bank for tourism development. Before the late 1960s, these institutions, the Inter-American Development Bank and the World Bank, didn't give loans. They didn't loan money for tourism development. But Cancun was the first example here. And Fonatur was the intermediary between these institutions, these multilateral institutions, and the Mexican state. So Cancun developed with a master plan. Going back to the comparisons, Acapulco served Mexican domestic markets even when it also attracted foreign middle class and elite tourists. But from the 1980s onwards, with the decline of tourism in Acapulco, it's reverted to its original role, attracting Mexican tourists, especially on weekends and during these puentes. Acapulco, in fact, even during its iconic Hollywood-esque years of the 50s and 60s, has always had an eminently popular flavour. And I'm using the word popular here as we would say in Spanish. In other words, it's of the people. It's always attracted people of very modest means. Skilled workers, public sector workers. You can camp out on the beach in Acapulco, and if you actually go to Acapulco, you'll see very often that people who can't afford to stay even in a cheap hotel will actually pitch their tent on the beach, much to the disgust of the hotel owners there. So this kind of popular character of tourism in Acapulco contrasts very much with Cancun, which from the beginning was designed from the late 60s and early 70s. Cancun opened its first hotel in 1974, was designed to appeal to foreign and then some domestic grand tourism, which is the translation of gran turismo, with the US, Canada, and then Western Europe as targets. And from the 1980s onwards, Cancun was also a major showcase, intended to be a showcase for modern Mexico, used as a location for ministerial, presidential, heads of state meetings and summits. If you go back over the history of the last 20 or 30 years, you'll often see that major intergovernmental meetings have been held in Cancun, not in Acapulco. However, tourism centers increasingly become supersaturated very quickly. So even though Cancun only opened its doors to hotels in 1974, by the early 1990s, Cancun is regarded as a saturated and overdeveloped tourism city. And tourism entrepreneurs began to look south of Cancun to an area that's been renamed the Mexican Riviera. I'm not sure who came up with the idea of appropriating the term used to refer to southern France and southern Italy, but obviously it was a genius kind of term. All the way south for about 150 kilometers now from Cancun, almost to the border with Belize, which used to be the old British colony of British Honduras. Now you've got the development of a new kind of tourism. And by 2008, this area known as the Riviera Maya had more hotel rooms than Cancun itself. And the development of the Riviera Maya south of Cancun is linked to the development of what some people have called post-Fordist tourism. In other words, post-Fordism in the sense that this is a tourism which is not based around massification, large-scale mass tourism. It's about exploiting niches, adventure tourism, cultural tourism, environmental ecotourism, rather than the traditional sun and sand, sol y playa. In Acapulco, going back to the contrast, visitors and residents live within viewing distance of each other. If you go to Acapulco and stay in your hotel on the beach or near the beach, you can actually see the places where your waiters and your recamareras, the women who change your bed linen, live. You may not realize that, but if you look into the hills around Acapulco, that's where these people live. That's obviously provoked some tension in the history of Acapulco. Acapulco does not have a hinterland of major monumental, cultural and archaeological resources. I'm not sure if I'm going to have time to talk about this, but it's another major distinction here between Acapulco and Cancun. Acapulco is not surrounded by monumental pre-Hispanic culture. The Aztecs and the Mayans are not present in this area. We don't expect Mayans to be there, but at the presence of the Toltecs and Aztecs and Zapotecs and Mixtecs, these other monumental pre-Columbian civilizations, is very weak in the Acapulco area and in the state of which it is the biggest city, called Guerrero. Very few museums in Acapulco, even though it is the oldest of these cities, and it's the one with a long colonial past. There is a fort, the Fort of San Diego, but it's never really been developed. By contrast, Cancun, even though it's very new, it's super modern, it's actually has a huge hinterland of archaeological significance. The Yucatan Peninsula, this southeastern bit of Mexico that sticks out into the Caribbean, is of course the heartland of one of the heartlands of the Mayan civilizations and culture. So visitors to Cancun can enjoy instant archaeological gratification. And although this was not, I think, part of the original planning of Cancun, it's actually visits to such major Mayan sites as Chichen Itza, for example, but also now Tulum, have become an obligatory part of the tourist experience here. And the government of Mexico and the governments of some Central American countries have tried to develop transnational concept involving the development of highways and joint publicity and marketing built around something called the Mayan route, or the Mundo Maya, the Mayan world, because the Mayans are present also in Guatemala and in Honduras, as well as in Mexico. Acapulco has not expanded. I should go back here to make the point that whereas at Acapulco, the tourists and the workers can see each other. They're very close to each other. The planners, the urban planners in Cancun, from the very beginning, were determined to separate these two zones. The hotels were placed in one particular area, known as the hotel zone, the zona hotelera, but the workers and the employees were placed in other areas. Nowadays, especially modest income tourists may cross these borders, but they weren't originally intended to. And since I don't have any more time, I'm just going to finish off by showing you just a few more. This is modern day Acapulco. This is another shot of that dramatic scenery in the background here of mountains, which gives Acapulco a very different flavour to Cancun. This is the hotel strip here. A spit of land. Behind it is a lagoon to which disastrous things have happened ecologically. Out here is, of course, the Caribbean. This gives you a sense of the enormous density of concentration of hotels here. So I'm going to stop there and just note the fact that for me, as a historian, the history of these two very different models of development is an opportunity to explore the kinds of things that historians have been doing elsewhere. It's about the study of social conflict, of social movement, of struggles over the use of land. It's about the relationship between states. It's about how leisure, how the workday has evolved, although I haven't had time to talk about that in today's talk. So tourism is something which I think warrants close study. It's not just a frivolous, marginal issue which no academic who's serious should pay any attention to. So I'll stop there.
Well, I'd like to thank Professor Carr and open the floor for questions.
Tourism was more or less abolished by the Cuban Revolution for a variety of historical and political reasons, but with the collapse of the Soviet Union, with what's called in Cuba the special period in the history of Cuba, Cuba very quickly had to find new sources of foreign exchange. And what they could do very, very quickly, beginning in 1990, was to promote tourism with the help of co-investment from Spain, Italy, and so on, Jamaica. And it's true that, I mean, Cuba now has 2.3 or 2.4 million tourists, and almost none in 1990. They come from everywhere except the United States. Even from the United States, actually, they come illegally under US legislation. I think that tourism developers, especially in Cancun, because after all, Cancun was developed precisely to target the Caribbean, this boom that was happening in the 60s, 70s, and 80s. I think everybody, Cancun and also the Dominican Republic, which is the great competitor to Mexico. The Dominican Republic has relatively cheap, it's low sector, middle sector tourism. I think they're very worried at what might happen should, for example, which I don't think will happen in the short run, should relations between the United States and Cuba be regularized, because all the market research done in the United States shows, and it's not remotely surprising, that all the research shows that, I think it's the extraordinary figure is that I've seen that about more than 50% of US people polled would travel to Cuba for a holiday if given a chance. In other words, Cuba's the forbidden fruit. Now, Cuba has no capacity remotely to be able to absorb even a tiny proportion of that. But I think the other islands of the Caribbean are very concerned because prices in Cuba are relatively low, and beaches and, in fact, tourism in general in Cuba have been relatively poorly exploited in the past, so therefore they're much fresher. So yes, I think that Cuba is the hidden anxiety focus here, and it may very well, should there ever be regularization of relations with the United States, I think that hoteliers, not only in Cancun, but in the Riviera Maya, which is, by the way, this area south of Cancun, I think will be very, very anxious. Even with very little historical research, it's by the fact that it's known that ejidos were expropriated here. I mean, it's a fact, it's very easy to establish. There's been almost no research on how exactly the expropriation process happened and what happened to the owners of this land, or the peasants who receive land, who are known in Mexico as ejidatarios, people who receive ejidos. Officially, they were compensated for the loss of their land, which was expropriated por utilidad pública, out of national interest. They were given, many of them were given money for their land, but in some cases, some of these ejidatarios became quite significantly wealthy by peasant standards. In other cases, they were relocated to poorer quality land, because what they lost was their opportunity, their access to the ocean, and their opportunity to benefit from the increase in land values. But really, the history of that expropriation process is little known, but it is something that is absolutely central to the history of Acapulco. In the case of Cancun, because it was sparsely populated, this problem didn't exist, this issue didn't exist. There was no land reform in the Cancun area, so the land could very easily be acquired by the state from a few wealthy private developers, and the land was kind of, in a sense, almost public land to begin with. The people who, the body that was set up in Acapulco, the Junta Federal de Mejores Materiales, the federal body or committee for material improvements, which was the kind of body that decided on these matters, claimed that the expropriation of land reform units was perfectly fine because peasants were not using the land, and it was poor land anyway. Land close to the ocean was relatively poor. This was, of course, what you would expect expropriators to say, that there's no problem, the land's not being used anyway, therefore let's give peasants a bit of money and let's put them on land that's more valuable. In fact, the evidence is rather more complex than that. We do know that some of that peasant, of these ejidos, were actually being used. But the land reform sector in Mexico has never benefited from very substantial aid and assistance, so it's never been operating at optimum levels. It's more, I think, a political, a cultural and social benefit to peasants than it has been an economic benefit. Yeah, I haven't mentioned this. If I was giving this talk in the United States, for example, the first question that everybody would ask is, well, it's not surprising that people are not going, foreigners are not going to Acapulco at the moment, because the one tourism area of Mexico that is affected by this extraordinary wave of violence, the 60,000 people who've been killed in Mexico since 2006. The one tourist area that has been affected is Acapulco for a number of complicated reasons. In other words, there is a very high rate of a high murder rate in Acapulco. Not in the tourism areas, I have to say. They're mostly in proletarian areas, shantytown areas. Most of the victims seem to be people who are involved in one way in the drug trade. However, there are always innocent victims. There are people who are in the wrong place at the wrong time. So that has had, I think, an impact on the foreign vision of Acapulco. It hasn't affected Mexican domestic tourists, who make up, say, 95% of the people who go there. Because basically, if you go to the tourism areas, you're not really you're not seeing the bodies without heads, the decapitated bodies that turn up outside of brothels and low-life bars and so on in some of the poorer areas of the city. But it is a serious issue. Elsewhere in Mexico, the violence that we've been reading about so much basically happens in areas which are not visited by tourists, with the possible exception of some of the border cities, which have a very different history of tourism. It's not really tourism about which I've been talking. But Acapulco does have, and still has today, and the argument I've heard which explains this is that Acapulco has been, well, first of all, because it's tourism, it provides a market for recreational drugs that's fairly high. Secondly, that because it's such an attractive and it is an extraordinarily beautiful place, that it is also a favourite place for the narcotraficantes, to establish their homes in. And therefore, if you're trying to, since there's a civil war going on between the different bands and cartels, it's not surprising then that Acapulco has become a centre for the struggle between the competing bands of drug traffickers. Cancun, I think, originally was planned to tap the North American market, the East Coast market, that didn't go to Acapulco and the Pacific Coast. But what happened in the end was that it also attracted the attention of Western Europeans. Not so much in Cancun itself, but the Riviera Maya, south of Cancun, has increasingly been colonized by Western European, Italian, Spanish, French capital on a small scale. Small hotels, very expensive, ecotourism, which I can't afford to enjoy because it's $600 or $700 a night as opposed to $50 to $100. And people who are building homes. The segunda casa phenomenon has been present there, as it also is present in the case of Acapulco. But whereas Europeans have never gone to Acapulco on a big scale, they do go to Cancun. That difference of 2.5 hours in the plane trip from Europe, roughly 2.5 hours to get from Acapulco to Cancun, seems to make quite a significant difference. I mean, this is the issue of enclave development, which is a serious issue that has been much discussed and debated. Both Acapulco and Cancun, in some senses, are enclave forms of development, especially in the case of Cancun. And so there are issues which relate to sovereignty, distribution of benefits, who benefits from tourism development. Is it the workers, the people who are employed? Is it the owners of capital? Is it the migrants who are attracted to these areas from other poorer parts of the country? Is it the owners of foreign franchises, or is it foreigners? These are difficult questions to answer. All of those benefit in some way, but the benefits are very unevenly distributed. But there are issues of ownership. You may know that under the Mexican Constitution of 1917, the fundamental document of the Mexican Revolution, the Mexican government prevents foreigners from actually owning property, either on the coast or within, or on the borders, or within, I think, 50 kilometres or 30 or 40, I can't remember the exact number of kilometres of the coast. This is a very sensible strategy. Now, after all, if you're trying to protect sovereignty, borders are important. But what has happened since particularly the 1950s and 1960s is that a whole series of legal devices have been invented by lawyers, especially, but by real estate developers, which enable foreigners to actually acquire property. They don't legally own it, but they enjoy a kind of long-term lease, technically from people who are Mexican citizens who own the land. But de facto, it is possible now as a foreigner to actually acquire property even in these prohibited zones. It's just that you have to do so by going through a very elaborate series of legal and often quite expensive procedures. So Elizabeth Taylor, for example, who along with the film crew that made the Night of the Iguana, which launched another resort area, Puerto Vallarta, into the international headlines in the 1970s, when she was there with her husband, Richard Burton, took a great shine to Puerto Vallarta and decided she wanted to acquire some land on the beach where the film was made. So actually, technically speaking, Elizabeth Taylor was an ejidataria. In other words, the land that she acquired was actually legally land that was in the hands of peasant beneficiaries of the land reform. But increasingly, the peasants who owned ejidos have been allowed over the years, beginning quite a long time ago, to alienate that land. It's actually illegal for them to do so. But there are a variety of ways in which you can use prestanombres, people who professionally lend their names to these operations. And now legally, you can actually do that. So there's a lot of bizarre hybrid Mexicans on the coast, and that itself would make for a very, very interesting study. Which of the two models? Now, of course, these are extreme models. I don't believe in continuums where you've got, extreme polar opposites, because that's a very dangerous kind of way of looking at things in the social sciences. But these are two very extremely different models, and for the reasons that I gave and many, many more. I don't think the Acapulco model is replicable anywhere else nowadays. It developed in this chaotic, lengthy, punctuated by periods of no growth and then very fast growth, because it started very early and before the notion of sort of state planning and before there was multilateral institutions that gave money for tourism development happen, and at a very different political phase in the political history of Mexico. So I don't think the Acapulco model is kind of replicable anymore. The model that seems to be attractive to governments in particular is the kind of Cancun model. And I mentioned there are 5 other poles, development poles like Cancun, somewhat less well known, like Ixtapa, Los Cabos in far northwestern Mexico, Huatulco and so on, which have not been as successful as Cancun. What I would say is that there is no benefit as such for me in the fact that a resort is developed with a powerful master plan organised by the state. It depends upon what kind of a state you've got, how democratic the process of design and planning is, and whether the plan is actually kept. If I had more time, which I obviously didn't have, I would point out, I would be able to show you that in spite of the master plan for Cancun, it looks wonderful, it's there, but in fact it's been nibbled away at, it's been compromised in a variety of ways. What's striking, I think, about Cancun is that the speed of development, which is partly the result of its central planning, is also the cause of its decline. Its growth was so dramatic from almost nothing in 1974 to millions of people in the early 1990s, meant that its prosperity did not last very long. Hence the expansion now beyond the borders of Cancun, further south along the Riviera Maya. I wouldn't advocate either of these models. I think there are some benefits that come from both of them. As a historian, I'm very upset by the fact that Acapulco, which is the historic city, which goes back to the colonial period and has the wonderful Manila galleons and a wonderfully rich history of transnational contact between Asia and the Americas, that this has never been adequately exploited, and that people can go to Acapulco and never get a sense of what happened in Mexico before the 20th century. That's unfortunately a feature of partly of geography and of the interest of the decision makers in the case of Acapulco. So I wouldn't advocate. I'm not actually trying to reach a conclusion about the merits of either of these. I think there are some advantages in both of those. I'd like personally there to be opportunities for contact between visitors and the people who provide them with services. I think that's very important that they see each other. The Cancun model separates those two, and what's happened though is that tourists often want to violate these separations, and so the tourists in Cancun, even foreigners, now do visit the parts of Cancun which are inhabited by the people who work in their hotels. But they were not supposed to under the original master plan. So there are good things and I think bad things about these two models. But overall, the Acapulco slow, uneven development involving thousands of private sector groups is not replicable, I think, in the late 20th century and early 21st century.
A related question, why did you end up choosing these two?
Well, I haven't. I mean, I'm writing a book about the history of tourism and leisure in Mexico, and one of the polemical points I'm making may seem strange to you is that I argue very strongly that writing the history of tourism should not privilege the study of beach resorts, which a lot of it does. Now you would say, well, why then are you using these examples? Well, it's partly because there is more research on possible on these two topics. But in the book I'm writing, I spend as much time looking at the interior of Mexico as I do to the beach resorts. But it's true that in modern day Mexico, I haven't seen the latest figures on this, but most tourists who go to Mexico today in the year 2012 do tend to go to the coast. And that was not the case before the 1930s and 1940s. In fact, the history of resorts all over the world, including in Europe, show us that, well, certainly well through the 19th century until the end of the 19th century, tourists didn't particularly like the water and the ocean. I mean, there was a certain amount of fear about being close to the water. Water and so on was seen as dangerous, was seen as a source of infection. People liked to look at it and to walk near to it, but you didn't actually want to be too close to it. So there was quite a revolution around the 1870s and 1880s when these fears began to disappear in Europe. But in Acapulco, the very first hotels were not on the beach. They were actually overlooking the beach on the hills around it. So that's a long answer to your very simple question. Why choose these? I'm studying the larger picture of tourism and leisure, but I've chosen to look at this today because it's a particularly dramatic opportunity of seeing two very different ways. Sorry, John. Two very different ways of promoting development of tourism, and there's no other pairing of places that I can think of within the Mexican interior that would allow for that kind of comparison. Right. Well, it's had a huge impact, particularly in the hinterland to Cancun, because the Mayan population is still there. This is, of course, the big challenge to cultural tourism and heritage tourism. I mean, the Mayans are more than a frozen stratum or layer that existed between the years 200 AD and 1250 AD. And so the big challenge is how do you introduce, in this case, an ancient people in such a way as not to restrict yourself to an examination of kind of frozen, epic, monumental architecture, which is what happens there. How do you integrate the modern Maya not only not to give tourists, both local and foreigners, an opportunity of understanding different people, but also to provide benefits to the modern Maya. I'd say that there are very severe problems here. The way in which the Mayan world has been exploited here, and also in Guatemala and Honduras, tends to ignore the contemporary history of these peoples. Their political and economic and social and cultural history is largely ignored. The Mayans are present because of the fact that their ancestors inhabited what appear to be monumental cities. And it leads to, if one was an archaeologist, which I'm not, it leads to the most appalling deformation of the archaeological record. For example, when the Mundo Maya, the Mayan world, this kind of intergovernmental project for marketing tourism throughout the Mayan world, when it was launched, El Salvador wanted to get in on the act, naturally. After all, it has borders with Guatemala and with Honduras, which also have. But the fact is that El Salvador the Mayans were not in El Salvador. There was a tiny presence of the Mayan culture in El Salvador. But El Salvador, the indigenous past, is mostly a Nahuatl-speaking past. It's the population that came from central Mexico. But if you arrive in San Salvador Airport, the capital city of San Salvador, you'll see signs saying, "Welcome to El Salvador, part of the Mayan world." Well, I mean, one wants to burst out laughing. So there are very severe challenges here to those of us who want a rather more disciplined and socially, I think, aware and conscious approach to involving contemporary actors rather than presenting the heritage of those actors as a kind of frozen layer of 1,000 years ago. I'm not sure whether I'm dealing with the issues that you raised there, but that's certainly one of the concerns that has been expressed in recent years, along with, I think, the complete failure in the handling of the Mayan issue in here, of the contemporary challenges posed, for example, by the violence and the genocide and the conflicts of the period from the 1960s and 70s and 80s. All over Central America, but particularly in Guatemala. Having said that, if you visit southern Mexico, the state of Chiapas, where the Zapatista movement began, I mean, I didn't have an opportunity to talk about that today, but there is a kind of Zapaturismo, which has emerged since 1994. And while one may smile at that, it's actually a form of tourism which, in some cases, is actually controlled by the historical protagonists, the actual actors in the modern Zapatista drama. So there are interesting ways. There's cultural tourism, which is controlled by the people at the grassroots level, and where benefits flow to the grassroots. And there's cultural tourism where the benefits are appropriated by intermediaries who don't live in the area, but who are the people who buy the handicrafts and the pottery at very low prices and sell them at very, very high prices to both domestic and foreign tourists. But it is quite a complex story.